Hi, everybody. My name is Sunil Seth. I'm one of the fellows in the cardiology over at SUNY Downstate. And just going to put together a list of compilation of different videos and impart some of my things on demand for you all. I think that this is designed to complement the weekly live sessions. This is something that I've thought about for quite some time. And I think that hopefully I'll be just let me know what feedback you have and if you find this useful or just different mediums here. So, all right. Well, first of all, let me just give you a little bit of background about myself. I think that the background is can be useful for you all to understand and maybe put into context, maybe any credibility or lack of credibility on my part. So I I started off actually at the University of Michigan, where I did my undergrad, Bachelor's of Science in Molecular and Cellular Biology. And it was actually during this time, this was the first time that I actually did any kind of research. I was looking to obviously to try to get into medical school, and I was at a great research institution at Michigan. So initially, what I did was in my first summer, my second summer after college, I was able to link up back home in Kalamazoo, Michigan, where I was working with a cardiologist who actually had trained over at the Cleveland Clinic. So I did some stuff that I quite didn't fully understand. I was working with some databases and looking at patient stuff. It was essentially, looking back at it, was about blood pressure and congestive heart failure, which ironically enough, I later on would do some training in heart failure myself, many years later. But my first real research experience, apart from that summer, was a little over a year over in the metabolism and endocrinology and diabetes lab, where I did some basic science research and was able to publish something years later after I graduated medical school, actually. So it took several years, but I think it was just trying to find my way with research. But that was my first research foray. I didn't get a chance to get involved in any research in medical school actually, and then when I was in Washington D.C., I did try to do some research too as well, but didn't really know exactly what I was doing, and I felt quite overwhelmed in the sense of like trying to balance everything out, which I think is very germane to this first video in terms of like discussing organizing principles for research during training, but ultimately what I ended up doing was I did some research training programs. I actually did a Master of Public Health at the University of Southern California. So it was actually an online program that I did. And then what I also did is I did a Global Clinical Scholars Research Training Program, which I became proficient in STATA. I was among the first in both groups to do that. I actually finished my residency training here in Brooklyn, New York, at the NYU School of Medicine, and then afterwards I did advanced heart failure at NYU Langone in Manhattan, where I really developed a lot of clinical experience. And it was actually during this time I tried to get some research involved, doing some research involved while trying to get a cardiology fellowship, but ultimately was not successful. And afterwards, went on faculty, stayed on faculty at NYU, returning to Brooklyn. But one of the things I think I learned along the way, importantly, was I actually decided at this point in time to become my own principal investigator. And this was the idea that, well, I have an MPH background. I've done some stuff before, just kind of like, putting it together. And I think why this is relevant to you all, you don't have to go through all this additional training. I think what I'm aiming to do here is to impart on yourself the idea of self-empowerment. And I think that the ability to understanding that you do have an ability and within yourself and working within yourself, because a lot of the things actually, while I was officially a hospitalist scholar at NYU, I didn't really have any research mentorship or any guidance, not really hands-on. So I think what I learned, there was a lot of things I learned along the way. And I think ultimately one of the recurring themes here is that there are going to be things that you're going to learn during this process individually for yourselves that I think will be hopefully helpful for you. So without further ado, it's a little bit of background. I've done a lot of different training programs, and then I actually went to Columbia and I learned more at doing a cardiac amyloidosis fellowship. I was the first fellow there in 2019 until 2020, and I think we all know what happened in 2020. But nonetheless, ultimately, I ended up matching into cardiology, and I know that specifically that's the purpose many people want to do. So what I'm going to do, we're going to discuss a little about individual organization, I'm going to talk about team-wide organization too as well. I threw this together fairly organically. There are some ideas down the road that I'm going to have in future weeks where I'm going to discuss exactly, specifically, looking at specifically when it comes to single center retrospective studies and kind of compiling the things of like, how do you go from something where maybe you have an idea for research, or maybe how do you cultivate an idea? How do you even begin? So I think there's some without trying to I want to respect everyone's privacy and research, and I also don't want people getting ideas scooped and stuff. But what I'm going to aim to discuss are principles. That's what I think are very important. The principles, for example, of understanding, okay, if you're doing a retrospective study, what are you aiming to study? What is your research question, right? But those are things that I'm going to plan to do in the future. But the first key that we should talk about is about organization. I think one thing that I've learned, not just in being a researcher myself, but also in mentoring people, which I've really taken on an active role over the last year. And what I've seen is, I can tell you this, is about, it sounds like the difficulty that many people encounter is putting together the time to research, putting together the time to study, time to do all these other things. And I think that one thing, that's why before we begin in talking about the actual specifics when it comes to research, is about organizing yourself and organizing your time, because there are many people that want to do research, but what I've seen is that many people fall by the wayside. And I saw this throughout. And so what you want to, the first thing that you need to do is to organize. And I'm going to talk about organization on both an individual level as well as on a team-wide level. So the first thing that I think is very important is to identify your bandwidth. And I think that was one thing that I can say I personally felt like I struggled with maybe early on, right out of medical school, and managing that as trying to do research when I was in Washington, D.C. Aside from the fact I didn't really exactly know what the heck I was doing, I think that was tough. So you want to identify your bandwidth. And what does that mean? Well, does it mean that you have on the resident level, USMLE examinations? Early in the fellowship level, I mean, you have your American Board of Internal Medicine, and then you also have other boards too as well. The reason why I'm starting this video now, I have this idea has been in genesis for a while, but I prioritize my ECHO boards, and so that was this past Tuesday. So you want to identify your bandwidth and what you're capable of doing. It's very easy to say yes to a lot of different projects, and I want to also I know everybody wants to get like an outstanding research application or outstanding application for fellowship. And then, from reviewing applicants myself, yes, everyone's got a ton of research and everyone's done all these things. And, there's a lot of people, by the way, that don't match into cardiology, and they publish a lot in pretty high impact journals like Journal American College of Cardiology. That's not to dissuade you from doing research, but it's just the reality too, is that there are also people that match and may have a case report or a few things. And so there really isn't necessarily a correlation, but I think the important thing is identify what your bandwidth is. So, what are your clinical duties? Some months are going to be busier than others. If you're a night float, I think, unless you're going to be in, sleeping dead, is that you're going to be walking dead. It's going to be very difficult to really be able to do research. So try to be realistic about what your duties entail, and accept that there are going to be times where you're going to need to take a break or take a step back, and that's what you're going to need to do. And then, of course, there's personal and family obligations. Everybody, we're not operating in a vacuum. And I can tell you that certainly that's also very important too as well. If you have other things that you need that's going on, and that's important too. I mean, it's beyond the scope of this lecture. This could go on for hours, but I mean, you need to have some balance. I think that's what has enabled me to be very effective, or at least as effective as I feel like I've been thus far. So, but have a balance. So that's important. Identify your time commitment. I think when I was trying to answer this question, I don't know if there's a formula to this, by the way, and you can't really base it in numbers, but what I'm going to try to do is I'll break this down. Let's just say in residency, when I was in Washington, it was the idea that, okay, maybe you have an 80-hour work week. And so they say that, you maybe commit 10 to 15% of your time to research, which computes to about 8 to 12 hours weekly. That's assuming that you're working an 80-hour work week. And I'm going to go into a little bit of some time frames, some graphics here. I think a very important thing is to work backwards. What are your goals, right? I mean, are you looking to publish something? Are you looking to meet a deadline for a conference? I think the important thing is to identify those deadlines and work backwards from there. One thing I learned is that when I was working with my program director on projects was that he wanted to have an abstract done 2 weeks before the deadline. And the reason for that is because you're not, it's not just you, by the way, that most likely submitting an abstract, okay? It's going to be you and your group. And you might have some co-authors or people that help to build a database or something like that. And I think that the thing is that the people need time to review it, right? So, you get something out there, great, but try to shoot for 2 weeks before so people have ample time to review it. This also helps too as well, because you want to make sure there are no grammatical errors or syntax errors when it comes to the mathematics or computations. That's quite embarrassing once you submit a abstract. You realize that maybe there's a typo. You realize that maybe there's a numerical issue that's incorrect because maybe the data was you analyzed the wrong data or an older file or something like that. So the key thing is going to be to organize, and you want to work backwards and give yourself enough time. Another important thing is not just your individual organization, but it's also working in teams. Okay, like I said, you're not going to be submitting most likely as an individual. One person cannot work in a silo. That is just not how research works. And the more that I do this, to emphasize this point enough, is that there is a power in numbers. And it was for that reason, that's why I decided that a WhatsApp group might be a very effective delivery for a number of reasons. One, to disseminate real time if there's any information or thoughts that maybe it comes in with an idea. Maybe I'm at a conference and I'm watching a lecture and then, okay, this is a great idea. Maybe we have data for this and maybe we can collect additional data, or maybe this will be an idea for a retrospective study down the road. But when you get to that level, I think that does, first of all, being able to think for yourself and decide, okay, what are your objectives and what are you aiming to do? So, for example, if you're looking at data collection, when I was one of the data projects that I did in the past was a heart failure preserved ejection fraction, and this was an example of potentially working in a silo. Theoretically, it was this, we're going to have a few people and we're going to work together and we're going to collect the data, but ultimately, people fell by the wayside after we had the IRB, and I think that the data collection became very onerous. Time was a very challenging thing. This was in 2018 to 2019. And then in 2019, while working nights as a hospitalist, in the middle of the night, I would begin collecting data. It took about I got the efficiency down to about 7 minutes when it came to collecting patient data for individual patients. But when you multiply that by 360 some patients, that's about 20 minutes or 42 hours. And that's just straight data collection alone. So it actually wasn't 42 hours. It's actually closer to more than 50 hours when you're trying to collect all the data yourself, because there's a lot of other things that's going on. So imagine how much time that's going to take. So I think that will be very important to keep in mind. And also imparting maybe some of the wisdom of how do you design a scalable project that would be a reasonable amount. When it comes to sample sizes, we can talk about power calculations, and those are things that I will plan to talk about in the future too as well. This is an example here that you have 168 hours in a week, right? So 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 168 hours. Now, you realistically, obviously not going to be able to work all that time, and your brain's not going to be sharp. And it's also not about time too as well. I mean, there are things you could do. You could chart, okay, how many hours did I spend in research, but how effective was the end product, right? So if you spend 15 to 20 hours, but maybe you don't have, it was just research or looking at publications, but you don't have anything to show, you're not going to get to where you need to be. A lot of ideas maybe when it comes to writing too as well. But if you're sitting there and you're stuck, you're not really getting anywhere. So the whole idea is making effective use of your time. And meaningfully, if you take out, assuming that you're on a clinical rotation, a couple assumptions you're going to make, right? Going from 7 a.m. to about maybe 5 p.m. So that's blocked off. And you're not going to, let's just say that during the day that you're not going to do any research, right? And let's say you're going to go to bed at 10 p.m. and you get up at 5 in the morning, right? So that's blocked off too. So there's 56 hours remaining in the week right there. I don't know how long, and that's assuming that you probably live at the hospital, which you don't. So it's going to take some time to commute. And if your commute's an hour or hour and a half, then that's 3 hours. And it's 5 days a week. That's 15 hours. So now you're down to 41 hours. And that's assuming, of course, that you're not doing anything else. So it's 41 hours now in a week. And then you break that further down into maybe where you effectively, like when you're sitting there after a long day of work and you admitted, you're 7 or 8 patients a day, or maybe you had a busy day or things ran late one day, you're in the CCU. And now, so now with the commute time, that's even further down because you need some time to rest and you go to bed early. So that instead of now you're maybe down to 35 hours, or and then you get further down. Time after time, if you're not replenishing yourself, that's going to add up. That's why I kind of highlight this idea. So not every hour is going to be equal. There are many things when it comes, for the lack of a better term here, called productivity porn, that you've seen probably all over the place. And I think I have this in the research wiki, but the notion that what you're doing is that willpower will decline during the course of the day. So maybe when you get up at 5 in the morning, and again, the basis behind something like the 5 a.m. club, and you get an early start to your day. And then by organizing your clinical stuff, I mean, yes, if you have a good battle plan and you're effective, then you might be able to carve out some time here and there. But the point is that you never really have enough time as you think that you do. So, and that's very important. One notion and one idea that I would encourage you all to consider doing is journaling. So chronicle your time, reflect on what went right, what went wrong. Maybe not in the realm of research, but how do I balance my strategy, having gone through everything that I did and trying to get into cardiology fellowship, and then also when getting there, is how am I going to make the most effective use of my time in cardiology fellowship that's going to build a foundation that I can carry with me, right? There's a notion that you could always invest money, but you can't invest time. I'm not sure I actually agree with that. I think you can invest time, and I think time can carry itself forward. And by laying the groundwork, effective hours, and the aim here, if this hour or whatever time that I have with you can be effective, then I think that this will be a good use of your time, rather than you spend it aimlessly and you're kind of lost. And it comes to another point. Okay, with time being so important, if you're stuck, reach for help. There are many times where maybe I'll perseverate and I will try to think of how to do something, and I will waste a lot of time and not get anywhere. So if you're stuck, reach for help. So how do you do that? Well, that's why you work in a team. Okay, so you have your co-investigators. Everyone has different research experience, and everyone has different experience in general. And I think that that's the strength in numbers. The experience that I have a great experience in my realm, but there are things that I haven't done, and there are things that somebody else can do very well. You specialize, right? And specialization is so key. That's what we do in medicine as it is. We call it consultation. So that's where I think there's a power number. So utilize your co-investigators, utilize your principal investigators, crowdsource, right? I mean, when you go to conferences, there are many things that I've learned, and I think that this genesis has come up from just looking at talking with people and getting their insight and experience. And I think that's what I've gathered, and you build something that's your own. There's online web forums, there's Reddit, there's YouTube. There's many things that can be very useful. The WhatsApp group can be very helpful. It's a chat group. And then there is also OpenAI in recent months. And so I think this can be especially useful for code. So that can be very key. The other thing with time is you want to streamline the process. I mean, to upload something and enter in all the stuff when you're submitting an abstract can take itself 45 minutes to an hour. When you finally get it all done, it can take a lot of time. When you're uploading the documents, I mean, one thing I've learned is when you're writing in Word, you have these documents in Word, but then now you have to parse it, because when you're publishing it, you need to have to figure it in a separate file. You need to have the tables in a separate file. There need to be captions. I'm not even mentioning about the references. The references section need to be formatted a certain way. And those are details that I think could be very helpful. There's different resources. There's EndNote, which I encourage you all to employ. I think EndNote is very useful when you're getting to the writing process. And that usually is available through your institution, but some kind of reference citation manager can save you a lot of time and a lot of headache. But you want to streamline the process as best as you can. I think this is only going to, I mean, dating this now, when we're doing this now in July of 2023, this is only going to get more streamlined when it comes to already where we're seeing with AI and helping to help write text for emails and so forth. So I think that will only streamline the process further. So you can and should probably modify your templates according to your needs. If you're doing writing a manuscript and a meta-analysis, I mean, there's certain things that are going to be rather templated. In the method section, when you're doing analysis, there you'll see this if you read enough manuscripts. And one thing I would encourage you all to do is look at the method section. And when you see this enough, you're going to see that many times it's going to be kind of like the same formulaic process, which is very helpful because then what it does is by recognizing this process, you understand the limitations, you understand what a study might be telling you. You want to, and these are things that I have in Word that I created, where you're utilizing quick parts or fields rather than typing in the same thing over and over, whether it be your name, your email address, and your institution, all those things. You could save. I mean, imagine you save 15 seconds, and then you multiply that by 10 times, so 150 seconds. So now you're saving a few minutes here and there. So by being efficient, that's going to save you some time. And as I said, willpower declines as the day moves on. You're only going to get more tired, as things will move along. So you want to try to guard yourself for that. So, and also I have templates for data collection when it comes to retrospective studies too as well. I think one thing I've learned is in real time, this can save you rather than collecting the data and then analyzing and reanalyzing. But there are some things with that that we can talk about in the future. The concept of time boxing, I think, is something that I found to be helpful, where you're dedicating time to write to data collection. I think this is particularly the key when it comes to the writing process. I mean, sometimes you might have a writer's block, but what you want to do is set aside some time where you are just dedicated to writing, and then some time for analysis. So consider where you're most productive and where you have a good state of flow or whatever you want to call it. For writing. You sit there and say, okay, no distractions. Turn off your phone, turn off, wherever. You can go somewhere and you can sit down comfortably and you can write. But your environment is also very important too as well. And then this idea has come to me now. But when it comes to data collection, one thing that I found to be super helpful was having a multiple monitor setup. I actually have 3 monitors set up. You can't see it, but this is a central monitor here. Actually looking at the PowerPoint's actually here. And actually switched computers now, but I have a third monitor over here. So that can be very helpful when you're, if you have, for example, collecting data in a chart, you have the EMR on one side, you have the spreadsheets on another, you're scrolling across. But multiple monitor setups are good. If you don't have that, you can split the windows, on the same monitor too as well. But that can be very helpful. Coming back to the idea of state of flow, Pomodoro technique, 25 minutes on, 5 minutes off. After 4 cycles, you take a 15-minute break. There's stuff you can Google on that. But I would take personal inventory of how you work and how much energy you have. Because again, it's all about prioritizing your time. So, do you find that maybe after a particular rotation that, boy, I wasn't able to get as much done when I tried to do this at 5 p.m. Or maybe that, I'm not able to get as many blocks. Or maybe after 3 blocks, I get pretty tired. Or I find myself that about 17 minutes out of this 25-minute block, I spent, like being distracted or something like that. So having concentrated work, and again, this is, I guess, the concept of that gets around there called deep work, where you're really getting effective use of your time. 4 hours of deep work or whatever it is. If you have productive 4 hours, that's better than saying 9 hours of, sitting around maybe not getting anything done. But there's also something to be said too in that process. Even in the 9 hours, and you realize, boy, that seemed a bit futile. You probably learn from that. You probably learn and realize, okay, well, maybe this is not a good idea. Maybe I need to go in a different direction. And that's going to be part of research. Research isn't always going to be your hypothesis is golden and you execute it and it worked out perfectly. That seldom is the case. And that was the case when it came to the initial HFPEF project. The whole idea was about language readmissions, and we actually found that we were thinking that, okay, there's no guidelines when it comes to HFPEF, and we don't have, so maybe it's maybe because it's so nebulous that people that don't speak English are more likely to be readmitted within 30 days. And on the converse, we actually found English speakers were actually more likely to be readmitted within 30 days. And there's many other confounding factors for that, because when you're doing a retrospective study, maybe they understand things better. Maybe they present to the same institutions, whereas the non-English speakers, maybe they presenting at other institutions. So there's a lot of other factors when it comes to the design of a project. But you have this idea, doesn't always work out. So is it a waste? Well, I don't think so. It gives you some insight, even the negative study. Maybe it allows you to pivot, because what it'll enable us to do is that although that initial hypothesis didn't work out, we have been able to publish several abstracts as a result of that same data set by pivoting. And that's something I'll talk about later in the future too as well. If you have several research projects going on and you have a busy month, you're going to have another jargon term, the Ebbinghaus forgetting curve. So I think one thing that can be very helpful is articulating clear notes about what you're doing. And I'm going to go give you an example of that here. So this is a recent example. I'm proficient in Stata and some other statistical software from my time doing my MPH. But one thing that I learned over at Columbia was doing analysis within that you can do within Excel. So I became fairly proficient in Excel here, and I'm going to show you here. This is a recent example. For studying, I copied and pasted all the Manos Biliakis lectures. There's about 21 hours of content here for interventional cardiology for Biliakis, and I numbered the videos and everything like that. Now, what I did here is that you can see that there's code here in Excel. So if I wanted to replicate this in the future, let's just say, like, 2 years down the road that I'm doing this for some other, I don't know, fellowship, or there's something else that's out there in a board review course, and I want to see, okay, how much time do I have? And so I'm kind of putting in, okay, the number of minutes and hours. You can see the time is not exactly correct. That's just a detail. But what I want to the reason why I'm highlighting this is that the notes here. So how do I fix times and avoid because when I was summing this up, it would appear to be 0. So how do I do that? Well, what I did is I have these saved, because later on, what I might want to do is, if I want to replicate this in the future and I want to, like, hide the code, then what I do is that maybe I do that. And so this brings up this website here, so that I saved. So consider what the key is here is consider, again, organization, making notes. I learned before, I was like, whoa, this was a great idea. How did I do this? And I can't remember how to do this months later. So that's the idea, that when you come back to something after some time, when you have a layoff, you go back to what you're you come back to where you were before. So okay. So make notes to yourself, and consider creating macros too as well. And that's where's the power. It could be a very power numbers. Somebody has a macro, and somebody has an idea or template. You create a template, and then you can share that template with others that you're collaborating with. Because if you're working across different institutions, you can create a multi-center. So that's something where it could be very useful. This is an example where I use OpenAI to quickly save some time. So if I'm looking at the code, I just type this into Chat GPT. I mean, yes, you can Google and things like that. Now this is the huge thing that in the past I would Google, I'd do YouTube and all these other things. Now you might be able to get a lot of answers this way too as well. So keep that in the back of your mind, that there is something very powerful about AI too as well. Important balance, as I mentioned before. You can't study 7 days in a row. You can't work every day without a break. So you want to make sure that you have a good balance in these things. Teamwork. Let me give you this is an example of it's not as important about just success, but also failure too as well. So while I've succeeded in a lot of things, there's a lot of things in which there have been frank failures, and I think it's important to talk about, because you're going to have that in your career ultimately. If you haven't, if you don't do that, then you might not be pressing yourself. You all are aspiring to get somewhere where you want to be. So there are going to be times where you're going to fail, and that's going to, including if you succeed and if you're in fellowship, there are times where you're going to fail. Things are going to work as well. I can tell you an example of a procedure that didn't go well earlier this week. That I'd been a part of. So I think that, like, those are things that it's important to keep in mind, that that's the reality. But I think that's just the nature of what we do. I had a large IRB that consisted of nearly 40 individuals. This was around the time of COVID. Everybody wanted to publish something, and Ultimately, there were people that were much more organized and better and had a team, and they were able to publish the papers on COVID-19 and characterizing COVID-19 in New York City. So the importance of a team, cannot be understated. Now, I mean, this was a hot area, and 3 years ago, and not everybody's going to be in the same workspace and same disease space. And working on COVID-19 was not going to get me into cardiology fellowship. I mean, it was just an idea to help out people. But I think that what we had is we had 40 individuals in the IRB. And ultimately, we ended up having 2 posters, and those posters ultimately, because there's so many people in the IRB, many of them didn't do anything. They just got their name on the IRB and everything else. But when it came to data collection or analysis, it was we didn't really get anything done. I had a manuscript that was almost done. We were coming up with the analyses, but because of other projects and everything else, and then ultimately getting into fellowship in cardiology, not that I would say that now that I matched that I didn't want to do it. But ultimately things took over, and it was, and time-wise, it was just like I had too many things going on. So I think that's an important lesson that you have to ask yourself is, what is your time commitment and how committed you are. You want to have some idea of a time frame, of an endpoint. That's going to be important. So, and I think to be fair, everyone should be able to articulate their involvement in a project. Don't just put your name on there or get yourself say that you want to do something if you can't do it. Okay, you have to look at what, because you sign up for everything, but nothing gets done, then you don't really get anywhere. And yes, you could put that on your application that you did this research, but people are going to wonder, well, what's your deliverable? What did you get done? And I can tell you that gets looked upon, where it's like, well, if you didn't really do anything, or you can't even talk about the research, well, that's a problem. So that won't help you. It'll actually hurt you, actually. So it's an idea of team organization, and I think one of the things that I'm going to highlight is this example. Earlier this year, I was fortunate enough to be part of a project that had a very organized team, and which we collaborate. This is a WhatsApp group, a screenshot that we had with a few people that we did, and so just advising them, and people were, we had someone doing writing, someone who did the figures, someone who did these things, and we were able to successfully publish gene therapeutics in cardiac amyloidosis, and this was published earlier this year. But the reason why I think that this was successful is because of a team approach. You had several people were dedicating their roles, people were committed to what they did, and that was an example of something successful. And so when you have a team, that's going to be very, very important. Modalities for team meetings, there's different ways of doing it. You can have WhatsApp groups, you can use Slack. Downside with Slack is, what is Slack? If you don't know what it is, again, it's a little bit more proprietary. So everyone has to be on board with the same form of communication. There are email groups. You can do email threads. It kind of has fallen by the wayside in some ways. Team meetings could be online, and what's also fallen by the wayside is the in-person team meeting. But for logistics, and I think that becomes very challenging, especially with everyone's commitments. But team meetings, online or in person, I think the workspace has changed a lot with the advent of Zoom and everything else that we have now. So making the most of your team, by having a team, you have someone who's going to be a first author, someone maybe these roles don't need to be exclusive, but it can be helpful. Someone who does, maybe specializes in literature search, or to collaborate with people outside, whether it be a medical librarian. There's someone who does the writing and formatting. You don't need to have a lot of experience. I mean, if you know how to use Microsoft Word, or you know how to do that, that is a very invaluable part of a project, because that takes up some time. So even if you don't have statistical knowledge, or you don't have clinical experience, or you just want to get involved and get started, this is a perfect opportunity to do that for the writing formatting. If you know how to find files and upload them to a portal, that is absolutely crucial. I mean, that's what many institutions, large institutions, will have research coordinators that will help with that. Someone who's versed in statistical analysis. Now, this is a little more of a nuanced area, but there's usually somebody that probably is best if one person does it. I can do this myself too as well. To some degree, I have some limitations. I don't have a PhD in stats. I have an MPH in biostats and epi, as well as doing some other things. But I think that if someone is well versed in a technique in a group, that is huge. So that's where the team part comes in. If you specialize in that, that's important. Someone else, again, you don't have to have clinical experience, but organizing team meetings and coordinating, so that could be very helpful. But you all can take turns and roles. You all can learn from one another, and I think that's going to be very important. So Those were just a little bit of points. I just wanted to, share with you all, and I think that the aim here that I'm going to do is try to provide some more information, and I will, I have ideas in the future for taking some examples of doing a retrospective study. With the aim here is not ultimately actually not to get me published. It's not really. I mean, my aim, in full disclosure, in a year's time, I'm going to be doing my interventional cardiology fellowship, and I'm going to be very busy in the clinical lab. So I see myself removing myself and taking a step back. But one thing that I've seen is that many people I've encountered, whether it be either in conferences, whether it be clinically in rotations or in consult services, everyone wants to do research, and having published before, that's very helpful. But also is part of it's the bandwidth, and at the risk of, I don't want to be impersonal, but the personal bandwidth of being able to help mentor. I think one thing that's very helpful is that many of the same questions come up time and again. And probably a year from now, 2 years from now, there's going to be somebody else probably in your position. You're probably going to be where I'm at as a cardiology fellow, and you're going to be moving on. So I think by one thing and trying to meet a need here is something where providing some guidance and reflecting on the experience, knowing that I'm going to be moving on, and my growth in another area, continuing that idea of growing and going somewhere that you haven't gone before. That's what I've been there when it comes to research, and I think for you all, hopefully that this will be able to provide you all with that too as well. So hope you find this helpful, and I will aim to chat with you guys later. Thanks a lot.